Hi, my name is Barry Setterfield. Welcome to this session. In the Bible there are many strange events which have been criticised and doubted by skeptics. In recent days, some scientific discoveries may have alleviated this problem to some extent. So we'll be talking about some of that here. Because we're talking about the Bible and science, there's going to be some technical stuff in here. But the good thing about YouTube is that you can stop it and go back and look at it again and get the hang of what's going on. So I commit this over to you. Thank you very much. The centre of this photo shows the remains of the old city of Jericho. This city existed during the Ice Age because of the springs of water there. In our first session, we saw how existing civilizations came to an end around 2300 BC. This included Old Jericho and its Amorite population. Around 1900 BC, the Canaanites lived there until a massive earthquake destroyed the walls sometime in the 1500s BC, which is about Joshua's time. We will come to Joshua's importance shortly, but first let's look at some of the main points we discovered in part 1 of this two-part series. Here is a chart of the 4 eras of geology and the 3 catastrophes which ended them. The earliest era was the Archaeozoic, which ended with Catastrophe 1, referred to by many geologists as the Snowball Earth event, but which presents overwhelming evidence of Noah's flood. The following Paleozoic era ended with the Permian extinction, which wiped out over 90% of sea life. It corresponds with the Babel catastrophe of Genesis, as explained in part 1, as well as the Bible and geology. The Mesozoic era which followed featured the dinosaurs. In part 1, we focused on the 3rd catastrophe which closed this Mesozoic era and opened the following Cenozoic era, which included an ice age. We saw the details of how that ice age came to an end, accompanied by the wipeout of many cultures. Let's look at this a bit more closely and set the scene, then pick up from there on the biblical results. The impacts of an asteroid swarm of 8 large pieces brought an end to the geological era called the Mesozoic, in which the dinosaurs were prominent. These impacts caused the 3rd catastrophe, known as the Cretaceous Tertiary or KT extinction. One of the largest objects in that asteroid swarm was about 20 to 25 miles in diameter. That particular object hit in the Yucatan Peninsula and formed the double-ringed Chicxulub crater, about 100 miles wide and 12 miles deep. The outlines of that crater on the Yucatan coastline are shown here. The strata beneath the coast reveal its existence. This swarm of 8 major pieces one-sidedly hit the Earth's original supercontinent of Pangaea. The impact sites are shown by the stars on the left image. These impacts split apart the original supercontinent and started continental separation, so that eventually the continents reached the positions they have today. The Bible refers to this event in Genesis 10:25 and states that the continental division occurred in the days of Peleg. In fact, he was named from this event, as the PLG root of the word Peleg means to suddenly divide by water. That is what happened to the supercontinent. At the same time, these huge impacting objects, up to 20 miles across, gave the Earth an axis tilt of over 27 degrees. This was at least 3 degrees more than today. The higher axis tilt meant that a larger area around the poles was without sun in winter, and ice accumulated there, as explained in part 1. This resulted in an ice age. The ice sheets covered the dark blue areas shown on this map. The only way the ice age could have ended was if the axis tilt was lessened by a later set of smaller impacts that caused the axis tilt to become the 23.4 degrees we have today. The yellow stars show the locations of some of these lesser impacts from an asteroidal debris cloud. The largest piece seems to have formed Burckle Crater, 18 to 20 miles wide, in the Western Indian Ocean. The base of the crater is in Ice Age strata, so this impact marked the close of the Ice Age. Data show this crater was formed by an object over a mile wide and moving at 20 miles per second when it hit the ocean. The thin lines shown coming from the nearby coastlines mark where giant tsunamis deposited debris from that explosion. Among the tsunami debris structures are these flat-top deposits on Madagascar. They are 590 feet high, 3 miles inland, and are 1,250 miles from the Burckle crater itself. The long axis of these deposits points directly to the crater. They have microfossils from the Indian Ocean melded with asteroidal metal, proving that the link is there. To form these structures, the tsunami waves would have to be well over 600 feet high. Scientists point out that for the Burckle impact to produce these results, quote, the impact explosion has to be estimated to be equivalent to at least 10 megatons of TNT, or roughly 650 Hiroshima-type bombs, end quote. They noted that this, plus the other associated impacts around the world, would cause fires, earthquakes, tsunamis, and general destruction of the existing civilizations. Archaeology and climate data agree. The timing of these lesser impacts ending the Ice Age varies from 2800 to 2200 BC, with a focus around 2400 BC. Huge fire and ash layers, the results of scorching winds from impacts, are associated with this time. Archaeology shows that worldwide, many known advanced cultures were destroyed by earthquake, tsunamis, fire, and related disasters in the interval 2500 to 2200 BC, including Jericho. This largely coincides with the time of these lesser impacts. In summary then, Part 1 established three things. 1. Sometime in the period from 2500 to 2200 BC, archaeology shows that many civilizations worldwide were wiped out by a series of disasters. 2. Independent evidence from climate studies shows that global weather changes occurred starting around 2300 BC. 3. A swarm of asteroidal debris formed impact craters whose origins cluster around 2400 BC. This third item, these impacts, become the suspected cause of all the rest, including the end of the Ice Age. Confirmatory evidence comes from the research of the late government astronomer for South Australia, George F. Dodwell, pictured here. He studied the change in the Earth's axis tilt, sometimes called the obliquity, as measured by 66 ancient observers back as far as 2045 BC. The yellow arrow points to the variation expected from theory. The red arrow points to what the ancient measurements actually indicated. They show that prior to 2345 BC, the axis tilt was over 27 degrees. That is more than 3 degrees than theory. But in 2345 BC, a strong change in the axis tilt occurred, eventually bringing it back to the 23.4 degrees we have today. This accords with the other data, indicating that this impact ended the Ice Age. In Part 1, we also discussed the actual time of the Ice Age. According to atomic dating, the Ice Age started 2.6 million atomic years ago and ended 12,000 atomic years ago. However, as was mentioned before, archaeological evidence indicates the Ice Age may have ended more recently. The data presented here suggests the impacts around 2400 BC ended the Ice Age. This is supported by all the Dodwell event data and agrees with archaeology, climate and Earth core studies. This dating discrepancy suggests we are dealing with two different clocks. Although my research did not start with this clock puzzle, the last 40 years of study have offered a possible solution to this discrepancy between orbital and atomic time. This has been published in various scientific forums and discussed fully on previous YouTube videos, which are linked at the bottom. These papers are also on the net on our website. Let us summarise the situation. Energy is put into the fabric of space as it expanded, in the same way as energy is put into the fabric of a balloon being inflated. In space, this energy appears as the zero-point energy, the ZPE. The ZPE is intrinsic to the vacuum, and it determines its electric and magnetic properties. As the expansion went on, the ZPE increased and the electric and magnetic properties of the vacuum changed. Since atoms are electric and magnetic in character, this process slowed all atomic clocks. Data from astronomy tell us how the ZPE has behaved with time. This astronomical data allows a possible correction to be applied to all atomic dates. Thus, the Pleistocene Ice Age lasted from 2.6 million atomic years ago to 12,000 atomic years ago. But when the astronomical correction is applied, we find the Ice Age really lasted from near 2900 BC until about 2300 BC in ordinary orbital time. This possible correction then harmonises the two types of time clocks and all the varied research results from different teams as well. There is even more important data linked with a shower of asteroid impacts of 2345 BC, which needs discussion. Research by Kawai et al., published in Nature in 1972, established that the direction of movement of the Earth's geomagnetic pole underwent a remarkable change in 2320 BC. This is right in the same time slot as the dotable axis tilt, the lesser impacts, archaeological disasters, and climate anomalies. It cannot be coincidence. The path of the magnetic pole is shown here. This implies that something happened at that time which also involved the Earth's core. How could the Earth's core be involved? The effect of impacts on other planets give us a hint as to how this may happen. We find that planetary cores focus the seismic waves of impact, as the diagram at left shows. For this example, the Calorus Basin on Mercury is the largest impact basin on the planet, and it's shown circled in red at the upper right. At the opposite point on the planet is the weird terrain, bottom right. A jumble of hills, ridges and chasms cutting across everything. The seismic P or pressure waves of impact were focused by the core, resulting in the weird terrain on the opposite side. In a similar way, the Earth's interior layers cause the pressure or P waves from impact to focus and accentuate their effects at the core complex, shown on the left. The right-hand diagram shows both the hot, liquid nickel-iron outer core and the solid nickel-iron inner core. Turbulence in the outer core results in the overall magnetic field as shown. However, some more detail is desirable here. At the time the planets were formed, the plasma model shows that radioactive elements were concentrated in the core region from Markland sorting. This was discussed in the sessions referenced below. The ongoing decay of these elements provides great quantities of heat, which causes continuing convection and turbulence in the liquid metal outer core. This is aided by the Earth's rotation and twisting Coriolis forces. This motion generates electric and magnetic fields. Here's how. The heat strips large numbers of negative electrons off the metal atoms, leaving them as positively charged ions. Then, because these ions are relatively heavy, convection and turbulence cause a slow movement of these ions, resulting in an electric current or currents with circling magnetic fields. By contrast, electrons have extremely little mass compared with the metal atoms. Thus, huge rapid flows of negative electrons occur as depicted in yellow. The currents involved from these flows have been measured by satellites at around 1 billion amps. These jet stream currents have associated magnetic fields. It is in this context that the Columbia University Earth Observatory commented, and I quote, "The electrical currents and convecting movements within the Earth's liquid core generate the planet's powerful magnetic field, which in turn drives the inner core in a way that can now be observed. About 1 billion amps of current is flowing into and out of the inner core across the boundary between the inner and outer cores. This current, in the presence of a magnetic field, results in forces being applied to the inner core, which then rotates. Essentially, the inner core rotates because it is part of a vast electric motor." End quote. Yet there is more. The inner core is freely suspended in the liquid outer core, so it can take up any orientation, even though its mass is 1.3 times that of the Moon. As we have just seen, the spin and orientation of this solid inner core is actually controlled by the surrounding electric currents and magnetic fields shown here. Thus, when these currents and fields are affected by focused impact pressure waves, the orientation and spin of the inner core would also change. In turn, this would cause a change seen from the magnetic pole's position. But there is one final thing. In all such changes, angular momentum is always conserved. To illustrate what this means, consider the left diagram. There, the spin axis of the whole planet and the core coincide as the black line. But then an impact occurs. The pressure waves change the direction and strength of the electric currents and magnetic fields in the core. So, in the right sketch, the alignment of the inner core changes from the original black line to the red, which is now the inner core's spin axis. In order to conserve the original spin momentum of the planet, the Earth's mantle and crust will then have to move the opposite way from the original black line to the blue line. Thus, in 2345 BC, the axis became more upright as a result. Since the rest of the Earth, apart from the core, has more mass, then the change in direction for the new planetary spin axis is not as great as the opposite change in the core. Thus, the core's magnetic spin axis differs from that of the planet. This change, due to electromagnetic interaction, is far greater than any gravitational effects that these lesser impacts could produce. These impacts, then, can, on the basis of electric and magnetic interactions, account for the Dodwell data, the core's behaviour, the archaeological record, and the end of the Ice Age. There is then one final aspect of the core behaviour which may be indicated by data from the Bible. Let's look at this and see what you think. 3 biblical events which occurred well after 2345 BC have been a puzzle for many. However, examination of the timing, as well as what actually occurred, reveals the 2345 BC connection. Remember that the 2345 BC date has a possible error of plus or minus 150 actual years. So let us go forward in time about 700 to 800 years from after 2345 BC to the period around 1550 BC. This places us in the general time of Joshua and the conquest of Jericho and the Promised Land. One of those battles involved the region of Gibeon and Ajalon. Here is the valley of Ajalon today, with the town of Ajalon itself just off to the left of the photo. The town of Gibeon is in the hill country over to the right. Joshua was defeating the Amorites who were fleeing west from Gibeon towards Ajalon, but he needed time to do that effectively. So Joshua called on the Lord to keep the sun standing above Gibeon on the right and the moon over the valley of Ajalon on the left. The outcome is given in Joshua 10:12, which reads, quote, "So the sun stood still and the moon stayed until the people had victory over their enemies. So the sun stood still in the midst of heaven and stayed for about a day." End quote. It was not just Joshua. The Egyptians recorded this event too. When the Greek historian Herodotus visited Egypt, he states that priests showed him very ancient manuscripts. It was recorded on some of them that there was one day that lasted twice as long as a normal day. For the second occasion, let's come forward in time another 700 to 800 years from Joshua's day. This places us in the period around 700 to 750 BC, when a key event occurred, namely the siege of Jerusalem by the Assyrian army. At this crucial time, King Hezekiah of Judah was on his deathbed. He wept before the Lord, and Isaiah the prophet promised healing for the king and deliverance for the city of Jerusalem. He then offered a sign to Hezekiah to validify God's promise. Indeed, Isaiah gave Hezekiah a choice, and the king chose to have the shadow come back 10 degrees on the sundial. The result was described this way, quote, "So the Lord brought the shadow back 10 degrees by which it had gone down on the sundial." End quote. 2 Kings 20, 1-11 and Isaiah 38, 1-8. It was not just Hezekiah. The Greeks recorded this event as the legend of Phaeton's disastrous driving of the sun chariot. The legend explains the event like this. Apollo's son, Phaeton, wanted to drive the sun chariot across the sky, just like his father did. However, Apollo said the horses were too hard to handle to let his son do this successfully. Phaeton persisted, and Apollo eventually gave in to the pleading of his son. But Phaeton indeed had difficulty in driving the horses, and eventually lost control in the afternoon. The sun's path became erratic, then it fell towards the horizon and the ocean in the west. The date of the legend? About 750 BC. In this case, there is proof that the Earth's core is involved in these changes as well. Allow us to explain. Ceramic jars with very distinctive handles bearing impressions of royal stamps were manufactured in and near Judahite Jerusalem. The handle shown here is typical of this period. The type of stamp changed with the political situation, so the time of making the jar can be accurately dated historically. Clay used for pottery contains many tiny magnetic particles. Initially, the alignment of the particles in an unbaked object is random, but when the object is baked or fired in an oven or kiln, the many magnetic particles in the clay align themselves with the Earth's field locally. Thus, baked jars, when magnetically examined, give information about the strength and direction of the Earth's magnetic field at the time they were made. This gives data about core conditions also. The Judean pottery researchers state that magnetic data from the stamped jars, quote, indicate a sharp drop of about 27% in magnetic field intensity over 14 years from 715 to 701 BCE, the time of King Hezekiah. This is an important basis for geophysical models of core-mantle interactions. End quote. The suggested reason for the dramatic drop was some, quote, unexpected turbulence in the core, end quote. Conclusion: the Earth's core was involved in the 750 to 700 BC event. For the third biblical occasion, we again come forward in time about 700 to 800 years from Hezekiah. That brings us to the events around Palm Sunday, when Yeshua rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, fulfilling Zechariah 9:9. Then, as Passover was about to be celebrated the crucifixion of Messiah occurred, fulfilling Isaiah 53. During that event, there was the record of a strange darkness from noon until 3 p.m. The prophet Amos foretold what was happened. Amos 8, verses 9 and 10 reads like this, quote, "In that day, says the Lord God, I will make the sun to go down at noon, and I'll darken the earth on a clear day. I'll turn your feast, Passover, into mourning, and I'll make it like the mourning for an only son, and its end like a bitter day." End quote. This event was not just described in the New Testament. The strange darkness was recorded by several others. First, the Samaritan historian Thallus in his comments in 52 AD. Second, the Greek historian Phlegon in 137 AD. And then there was Tertullian, as well as Julius Africanus in the Ante-Nicene Fathers, Book 18, Volume 6, page 130. In addition, Tertullian, Lucian of Nicomedia, and Rufinus all claimed it was recorded in existing Roman archives. In fact, the exact words of the Greek historian Rufinus to the Romans were, quote, "Search your writings, and you will find that in Pilate's time, when Christ suffered, the sun was suddenly withdrawn, and darkness followed." End quote. They are in Rufinus, Ecclesiastical History, Book 9, Chapter 6, Annals of the World, page 822, translated by Usher and Pierce in 2007. These three events form a time sequence if the Alexandrian Septuagint, the ancient LXX, text is followed. The impact changing axis tilt was 2345 plus or minus 150 BC. Joshua's battle with the Amorites was about 1550 plus or minus 100 BC. The time of Hezekiah's healing was roughly 760 plus or minus 50 BC. The crucifixion of Christ was 33 plus or minus 3 AD. These form a sequence of events which occurred every 775 years plus or minus 35 years. Is there a reason for this? Dodwell's research offers a possible clue. His data analysis revealed an oscillatory behaviour as the axis was becoming more vertical. A more precise study is needed, but this was a helpful beginning. Median crossing points of the oscillation seem to be the key. After the crucifixion, the next event was about 800 AD. In fact, the event shown on Dodwell's graph for around 800 AD was recorded in Europe, England and Africa. In each case, an unusual movement of the sun was involved. It was seen over too wide an area to be a solar eclipse. It was reported in a British Astronomical Association handbook for the mid to late 1960s. But we have more detail of this event around 800 AD from Emperor Charlemagne's campaign in Spain. Charlemagne's campaign in Spain was against the forces that wiped out his relative Roland. Roland and his army had been left to mop up the enemy remnants in Spain, but they were defeated through treachery and all were killed. In his Song of Roland, Charlemagne records that the sun stood still to assure him that God was with him in this battle to avenge Roland. That battle occurred here in the Roncevaux Pass in 15th of August 778 AD. A number of tribes in the Americas have similar stories of strange behaviour of the sun. North American Indian tribes, like the Ojibways, the Wyandots, the Bungees, the Omahas and the Dogribs, report this. Then there are the Mexican Indians, the Aztecs, the Quiche Mayans of Guatemala, and Peruvian tribes. Some reports date from Charlemagne's time, others from about 800 years later. The last event was about 800 years after Charlemagne. We have different evidence here. In March 1984, Dr. Mike Barbetti of the University of Sydney announced that Thai pottery revealed an event before 1600 AD that marked an unexpected change in the Earth's magnetic field. This was similar to the archaeomagnetic data in pottery from Iran around 2300 BC and the changes recorded in pottery in Judea around 710 BC. The magnetic field changes showed the motion of the Earth's core was also involved in this whole series of events. We are not totally certain, but if these events keep strictly to time, then the exact period given by the crucifixion in April 33 AD and Charlemagne in August of 778 AD is 745.3 years. Using this period and those two known dates, we can establish the following chronology. 2203 BC, the core settled down. 1457 BC, Joshua had his event. In 712 BC was Hezekiah's time. 33 AD was the crucifixion. 778 AD was Charlemagne. And 1523 AD was the pottery incident from Thailand. Some recent data from the Earth's core might just support this. Dr. H. Tukalchik of the Australian National University, Canberra, studied special pairs of earthquakes going through the Earth's core. His results were reported in Live Science for the 13th of May 2013 as follows, quote, "The solid inner core rotates eastwards. At the speeds it travels, it might complete a revolution every 750 or 1440 years, when the reference to the Earth's surface." End quote. This spin rate for the inner core had been induced by the effects of the 2345 BC Dodwell impacts on the electric and magnetic fields which control its rotation. The core rotation rate is either 750 years or 720 times 2 equals 1440 years. Bible events linked with the core motion seem to have occurred every 745.3 years after the core settled down in 2203 BC. Some data which emerged in 2015 may possibly allow us to explain the biblical results. Here is a diagram of just the inner core of the Earth. In 2015, it was discovered that this inner core had two parts. First, there was the outer inner core with a basically north-south crystal structure and polarity, as expected. Then, locked into the centre of that, there is an inner core whose crystal and magnetic alignment is east-west. So as the inner core rotates, either once a revolution if the rotation rate is 750 years, or twice if the rate is 1440 years, the like polarity of the inner core repels the similar pole of the outer core. This is the same as two magnets whose north poles are facing each other or whose south poles are facing each other. In each case they repel each other as the like magnetic fields push against each other. The whole inner core then performed an unusual motion to overcome the magnetic repulsion. This unusual motion of the inner core was possible because it was suspended in the liquid outer core. But in order to conserve angular momentum, that motion had to be counteracted by the bulk of the Earth. The effect seen from the surface of the Earth was that the Sun appeared to trace an S-shaped path in the sky. This could have a variety of consequences depending where on Earth it was viewed. Thus the day may be longer, the dawn delayed, the sun may go down at noon, or so on. This is possible because the dates of these events correspond with anomalous magnetic data from the core and also correspond with the Dodwell data. So it can be seen that the impacts which caused the end of the Ice Age had ongoing biblical and historical consequences. The lesson that we can learn from this is that it took science until 2013 and 2015 AD to find some of the data which supports this contention. The interesting thing here is that those who believed before they had this evidence were blessed. We have been blessed to be able to see the actual scientific evidence presented in our time. Thank you very much for your time.